Hello, I'm Juliette Foster and welcome to Diplomacy in Dialogue, a series of shows in partnership with the German Foreign Office aimed at examining some of the biggest issues facing the international community. Well, today's show is entitled Multilateralism, Joining Forces to Tackle Global Challenges. And over the next hour, we'll be discovering exactly what multilateralism means, why it matters, the opportunities and challenges that multi-state solutions can offer, and the role both Germany and the EU can play in this arena. Well, to help us navigate this complex subject, we have assembled a panel of experts. Let's meet them. Joining us from Berlin is Helga Barth. She is the Coordinator for Sustainable Development, Director for Human Rights, International Development and Social Affairs at the German Federal Foreign Office. Welcome, Helga. Next up is Thorsten, who's the Director of the Global Public Policy Institute. Thank you for joining us. And finally, let me also welcome Eva Croon. She is a German youth delegate to the United Nations General Assembly. Welcome to you as well. And before we start our discussion, let's examine the subject in more detail. Well, beginning first with the terminology. What is multilateralism? Well, it may sound complicated, but multilateralism is a term that describes cooperation between three or more countries who agree to work together to find solutions to common problems. In other words, teamwork or mutual cooperation. There are some issues that we generally recognise as requiring teamwork, including global health, climate change, international terrorism, migration, human rights, cybersecurity and economics. They're issues that are not limited by international borders and which affect millions of people around the world. Therefore, collective responses can often provide the quickest and most effective solutions. Multilateralism often takes the form of membership of international institutions, such as the United Nations, NATO or the International Monetary Fund, and it serves to bind powerful nations together. It also discourages unilateralism, where countries driven by their own interests act individually, and it attempts to give small powers a voice and influence they could not otherwise exercise. However, not everyone is happy with multi-state solutions. Multilateralism inherently requires a certain amount of compromise, sacrifice and acceptance, which can be especially challenging to nations who believe that protecting their sovereignty is a key role of government, the so-called my country first approach. So, why are we discussing multilateralism now? Well, 2021 is set to be a year of transformation. Joe Biden's recent presidential inauguration in the United States, the battle against the coronavirus pandemic, and of course elections in Germany and across Europe all point towards major shifts in the political, economic, social and environmental landscape. Can these leaders steer the world through what will almost certainly be a period of challenge and intense disruption? Is a reborn multilateralism a viable roadmap? And if so, what will the future of the international rules-based order look like? Okay, so there's plenty to discuss with our guests who've been listening in intently. Helga, let me start first with you. Now, the German and French governments, they recently set up the Alliance for Multilateralism. It brings together countries that believe in working together, and it's something we're going to discuss a little bit later. But aren't there enough multilateral bodies doing this already? And why, in fact, does the world need another one?
Well, thank you very much for the question. The Alliance for Multilateralism isn't actually a body to start with, and our entire idea was to strengthen multilateralism and its institutions with the UN at the core of the system. And it's a cross-regional forum that was built at our initiative to defend and adapt and reform where necessary the multilateral system in order to make it more resilient and to enable to provide answers to the most pressing questions of our time, such as COVID-19 pandemic, climate change or digital challenges. So, and it was born in 2018 out of the great crisis of the multilateral order that we all perceived.
The skeptic would say, well, this is all very well and good, but what you're offering is the same script with a few strategic adjustments. The actual core of the narrative hasn't really changed.
So this wasn't about changing a narrative and but much more about visibility of cooperation and gathering countries with the same values and the same aims, and even with values. I would say the alliance is of course values based, but not all the countries that subscribe to some of the events or declarations have done for all of them. So they could. I think Germany has subscribed to everything, and France as well. But there have been partners who were interested in some subjects, and whereas others weren't their real focus. So it's very much based on where certain countries are, where their positions are.
Okay, let's hold those thoughts, because I want to bring Thorsten into the conversation, because if you look at multilateral organisations generally, there is a sense that they may well be trapped in a malaise. And if that's the case, then why not focus on setting right what is inherently wrong? Why do we need to go outside the box to a certain extent?
I think that's actually what the Alliance for Multilateralism does as a catalyst. It looks at what a group of like-minded countries committed to multilateralism can do to improve the state of multilateralism. And in order to do so, I think it's useful to differentiate different circles of multilateralism, because not all multilateralism is the same. On the one hand, you mentioned NATO in the beginning. We have the multilateralism of the like-minded, small circles like the European Union, like NATO, most democratic countries. That's the first circle. It has problems because there's anti-democratic authoritarian tendencies also within these like-minded groupings. Hungary, for example, run by an authoritarian prime minister. We have Turkey in NATO and so on. So we have our hands full there. Then the second circle is like we have like-minded multilateralism of authoritarian powers. China sponsors multilateral organizations such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Russia has multilateral institutions that it sponsored. Then the third circle is the competitive multilateralism, universal bodies in the UN, where we argue on what is right and wrong, on human rights, on peace and security, on diplomacy. And then the fourth circle is genuinely global problems. And I think where we cannot choose, because on climate, for example, or on pandemics, we have to work together to produce global public goods. And that's the fourth circle of multilateralism. And I think what the Alliance can do is to look at each of these circles starting from a core of like-minded countries, democracies, it can strengthen these like-minded institutions, but then also find willing collaborators to strengthen the competitive multilateralism within the third circle, and global public goods multilateralism, of course, also on global public health or climate, for example.
Right, so it's finding the allies to work with, but clearly there are outsiders who would say there was still a problem with multilateralism, that whilst elements of it were working, there were some aspects that were failing. Now, are we talking about a problem which had been there for quite some time, or was it something which perhaps it took the Trump presidency to expose? The rut had already set in, and for various reasons, people were looking the other way.
No, I think there are some contradictions or illusions in the approach that many of us had with good intentions after the end of the Cold War. After the end of the Cold War, we thought we could just globalize and universalize human rights-based institutions, that everybody would kind of socialize into these institutions and support them. But in the end, reality took a different turn. We have the resurgence of geopolitical confrontation between the US, Russia, China, and that has its effects on multilateralism. You have a backlash against multilateralism in many countries where citizens are not happy. They're kind of prone to nationalist tendencies, and they don't want to be constrained by multilateral bodies. That, for example, explains Brexit. The slogan of the Brexiteers was to take back control from Brussels, and that's an appealing slogan too many, and multilateralism needs to deal with it. You need to build the support at the domestic level, and you need to make multilateralism work in this more geopolitically tense environment that we're living in now, where we cannot expect to globalize and universalize like-minded institutions, but we have to live with the fact that we have a clash of systems between democracy and authoritarian state capitalism, and we need to work this out.
To some of the things which I hope to touch on later in the discussion, but let me bring Eva into the conversation, because here we are talking about the concept of multilateralism, but very generally, why do you think the public should care about it? Because I guess that to the guy on the street, it sounds a bit academic, esoteric, not really worth their while thinking about.
Thank you, Juliet, for asking the question. I think it's not that much of a question of why the public should care about multilateralism, but how much multilateralism should care about the public. Of course, all multilateral decisions affect the people in their daily lives in a very abstract level, but agreements often don't interest the public in their daily lives. So it should be more making multilateralism accessible, communicating more about the successes, and creating accessible platforms and participation formats that lead to more satisfaction among the public. And in the long run, citizens will then care more about multilateralism.
Right. Again, being sceptical, one could say it's a very idealistic vision, especially given that globalization, it could be argued, and the inequalities it produced undermined whatever belief the public may have had in the value of multilateralism.
Well, 87% of the participants of the global UN 75 survey acknowledged the value of multilateralism. The international cooperation is the indispensable solution to the challenges of our time. So young people usually give international organizations a leap of faith because they are more optimistic about the future than other generations. But this trust must be earned. So the lack of success of those slow and complicated cooperation is not satisfactory. And success is often measured only by the fact that a compromise is reached at all. So we need to change the narrative of those negotiations. The focus on some outcome must change, and the multilateral efforts need to be measured by the substantive results of the compromise. That means multilateralism that delivers. Globalization has only reinforced existing structural and systemic inequity, leaving multilateralism more than ever before in a position to function properly.
Okay, let me bring Helga into the conversation, because Helga, earlier Thorsten was talking about circles in the approach to multilateralism. Let me take that concept and focus on the circle of the European Union, because there are existing fault lines in the bloc. For example, we saw that with the Greek debt crisis, how there were wealthy northern economies which resented bailing out their poorer southern counterparts. We've also seen newer divides emerge between the eastern members of the European Union and, of course, long-standing members of the bloc. So really, the point that I'm getting at is, can multilateralism overcome those existing fault lines, because they are entrenched, and there are some members of the bloc which perhaps don't really want to move away from that because they have their position, they are entrenched?
Yes, at times multilateralism can help to overcome those fault lines, because partners realize that the question on the table in Brussels is not just a question that EU member states put on the table in Brussels, but it's actually a question that drives other governments, other countries as well. So it helps to put them higher on the agenda. But well, the EU is of course much more than multilateralism. It's about pooling sovereignty. But you're absolutely right. There's some issues, especially some human rights issues, where it's become much more difficult to find common positions and common language with some EU partner countries. And we're going to see this at the next Human Rights Council, I suppose. The EU is very, be very much for a EU member state common position and as much compromise as possible. But for example, at the Human Rights Council, we very often go for as as much joint positions as possible, but also for cross-regional statements and more legitimacy with partners from other regions in the world. So multilateralism also helps to helps with some of the fault lines within the European Union. Thank you.
Thorsten, let me bring you into the conversation because you referenced this earlier in one of your arguments, because we know that there are some governments who believe multilateralism is a threat to their sovereignty and independence. Brexit was an expression of that sentiment. So the point is, how can multilateralism work alongside sovereignty without appearing to undermine it?
I think it's for those advocating multilateralism to make a clear case that if done right, multilateralism actually enables sovereignty, because, for example, on climate or on global health, we see that we do have to work together. Otherwise, if only a few countries work on this, we will not tackle these issues. So it's for those advocating multilateralism to explain how multilateralism indeed enhances sovereignty, understood rightly, and to make the case for that. But it's not easy, because nationalist sentiments are of course very appealing. Short-sighted arguments of taking back control, as we saw in the Brexit debate, are very appealing, and even within the European Union we have trouble. That's why the French president came up with this concept of European sovereignty, to take the thunder away from the nationalists, like the National Front in France, who harp on national, regaining national sovereignty against the European Union. And he wants to make a very strong case that only by pooling sovereignty, as Helga said, we can fully exercise our sovereignty. So it's a constant struggle to convince the public that actually multilateralism doesn't need to go against sovereignty, understood right, and that actually, and of course at the same time, we need to make sure that multilateralism does deliver results that citizens can experience, as Eva said, in their everyday life, and that multilateralism doesn't come across as something esoteric, but something that actually helps you in your everyday life.
Okay, and Eva, from your perspective, why should multilateral organizations embrace this particular moment to listen to young voices? What difference do you think you can make to the mix?
Well, the time to listen to young people is not derived from the pandemic itself. The need to work with young people existed long before, and the arguments for doing so remain the same, especially during the pandemic. Young people are often the ones reminding politicians to treat every crisis like a crisis, even when their freedom of assembly is restricted to prevention measures. And they come up with brilliant ideas. Thus, we are a relevant stakeholder group. There is no reason to not listen to young voices, on the other hand. But to make one thing very clear, it is not about listening to young people. It is about to let them negotiate, to let them discuss and participate meaningfully together. We need intergenerational partnership to achieve well-being for all, and that includes young people, especially given their current underrepresentation. The positive is, everyone is now very aware that a lot of real and meaningful youth participation can be achieved digitally, and young people can participate from their homes, which should make it even easier to enable inclusive and diverse participation for all.
And Helga, let's follow through on this, because we have gone through a pretty turbulent period with politics in the United States. Things have obviously changed there. But is the world ready to re-engage, if you like, with multilateralism? And was Donald Trump's presidency the wake-up call for multilateralism, that perhaps it had got a little bit lethargic and Mr. Trump woke it up, so to speak?
He actually helped doing that. We saw that the Trump presidency, it meant that there was a need for the rest of us to come together in defense of the system, because he was very often quite vocally pushing back at multilateralism, pushing back against the European Union, And the Alliance for Multilateralism was also born out of this need that we all saw. But what we perceived quite clearly that the Trump administration failed to persuade many other countries to join its attacks on multilateral mechanism. We even had some countries where we were quite surprised, like China, that they suddenly came out with very strong statements on multilateral approaches. But we think that the beginnings of the Biden administration are extremely promising. And we're very much looking forward to having a strong partner in the UN again on issues such as human rights and global health and climate change. And we told the US many times that we actually missed them, for example, in the Human Rights Council. So we think it makes sense for the US government also to drive issues in foreign policy together with friends and partners. For example, the corona response, that's an issue that is important domestically as well as abroad. So there is a lot of room for cooperation. Thank you.
It's interesting, just picking you up on something which you said, that on the one hand there were negatives involved with Donald Trump's stint at the presidency in terms of multilateralism, but on the other hand, he brought China into the fold. But if you had to assess the damage that he inflicted on multilateralist ideals, where was it particularly felt?
I think that was the withdrawal. But when he decided to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord, to withdraw from WHO, to withdraw from the Human Rights Council, so there's so many withdrawals. That was felt quite. That was very painful. And let's not forget what we were missing, of course, was not only American leadership. An organization like the WHO is so much less forceful in everything that it is doing for, especially for poorer countries without US contributions.
Let's follow that up as well, Thorsten, because you could argue that maybe a space was created for Russia and China to bring multilateral architectures into a closer alignment with their own authoritarian standards, precisely because the Americans had evicted themselves from the picture under Donald Trump.
Yes, you can argue by retreating from the World Health Organization. Of course, the United States made more room for China, and China made good use of that room, and, for example, also made sure that the head of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, was very close to Xi Jinping in his convictions. And I think that could have been different had the US decided to support the WHO and to put up a fight, because you do have a very concerted effort on the part, especially of China, to advance its own narrative, its own concepts, to go against universal human rights in universal bodies. And it does, but running away from that is no answer. It just creates more space for China to advance its own anti-human rights conceptions. So that's why it's good that President Biden decided to rejoin the Paris Accord, to stop the withdrawal from the World Health Organization. And I think it's now for other democratic middle powers to join the US administration in strengthening these organizations, in reducing the nefarious influence of China. And of course, we cannot stop China from its legitimate pursuit of creating alternative multilateral bodies, such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Many others. Japan has its own, bank that it started, and others have that too. I think that's the very natural process for great power. And there, we, as a democratic middle power, we just have to decide how to engage with these new formats, whether whether it's possible to co-shape these institutions, such as that's the European bet on the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or whether to better stay away from this and compete. That's, I think, should be the European approach to the Belt and Road Initiative.
Helga, let's stay with Joe Biden and his presidency. Aren't we in danger of perhaps presenting him as a knight in shining armour, the one who can really help to save multilateralism, given that realistically he's got enough on his plate already because he has to heal a country which is broken apart by political divisions. He's also got to blunt the impact of COVID-19. It's killed over 400,000 people. He's under pressure to vaccinate as many people as he can and regenerate, kickstart an economy which has been crucified on this pandemic?
Well, thank you for the question. Yes and no. We have received clear signals in Geneva and in New York that there is an appetite on the American side to cooperate much more with other countries and to engage more with the international community. They're going to be back, but of course as partners. But of course we see the constraints, and that he's going to have his hands full with the domestic situation. And it's not just this terrible pandemic, but it's of course also economic challenges caused by the pandemic and by other reasons as well. That is something that we are very much aware of. And the question, of course, is also what do we have to offer? And I think my government and many others decided to give that a lot of thought and to show to the US that we are that we're willing to take over more responsibilities. If that is something that we've, I think, achieved during these 4 years of the Trump presidency, is that we have to shoulder more responsibilities in the present and in the future.
But Thorsten, how reliable an ally can America be for the multilateralist vision? Because in the past, it has, on the one hand, simultaneously been the linchpin of that multilateralist order, and yet at the same time, it has expressed deep skepticism. It can't have it both ways.
I think we need to live with the fact that at different times, with different presidents, America does want to have it both ways. And that we can no longer just assume that the US is a benign power that supports the multilateral order that it helped to co-create. The real shock, I thought, of the Trump presidency was that he used the wrecking ball against the like-minded institutions that the US itself had helped to create, NATO, the European Union, and that he didn't shy away from using personal sanctions against members of the International Criminal Court, which I thought was a pretty crazy breach of norms to go after such an international body. But I do think we need to take up the US and work with them whenever they are run by a president and an administration that is in favor of multilateral bodies and that supports the multilateral bodies that it helped to co-create. But I do think we need to live with the fact that in 4 years we may get an administration that is not exactly Trumpist, but much more sovereigntist, much more skeptical of international cooperation. And that's why I think the Alliance for Multilateralism that Germany helped to co-create with France and Canada and other countries as a reaction to the Trump shock, we should keep it because we do need these formats to help catalyze support for multilateralism. Regardless, we cannot just say let's lean back just because we have a new administration in the White House. We need those formats longer term, and that's an important contribution that this German government has made. And I think on the flip side, it's also important for Europe to stand on its own feet, to take care of its own security, and to take this notion of European strategic autonomy and European sovereignty seriously. That should also be a result of the Trump shock, to work with the US wherever it's possible, where interests are aligned, but to also be prepared for a world where the US pursues a very sovereigntist agenda that goes against German and European interests at times.
OK, well, let's break off from this part of the discussion for the moment to actually hear the voices of the general public. Now, we put the following question to a random selection of people. What are the major international challenges facing the world in 2021 and beyond? And more to the point, how should they be tackled? This is what they had to say.
I think the major challenges for the international situation next year is going to be potentially overall getting the US back on track in terms of multilateralism and into the World Trade Organization. But I think there may be some practical issues to be overcome before that.
We are facing the big problem, Corona, and economy and everything is going to change. And human life also change because of the Corona.
I think the main big challenges for country and European country are, I mean, the climate change and climate crisis, obviously, because is happening right now.
I think one of the other issues is about equality, how because there are some sectors who are more affected than others, how we will handle, how we will help them.
One of the big challenges are many of the regional conflicts, which leads to the immigration problems in the EU.
Systematic racism, also internalized sexism still. Yeah, those I think are the biggest ones that come up to mind.
The major challenge I think nowadays, the one which is really obvious from me, masks on. Everyone is walking with masks on and we are really scared of each other, staying 1.5 meters among each other, so it's really annoying, and the worst thing that we don't know how to tackle it. I know vaccination started, but we don't know all the outcomes of it, but we hope for the best, and I think it's one of the most highest and biggest problem and concerns nowadays. So.
The thoughts there of the general public, quite a few points coming up there. So Eva, let me start first with you, because in terms of what was raised, we've had getting the US back on track, the economy, coronavirus, racism, the vaccination, regional conflicts, the impact on the EU, etc., with immigration, but also as well the environment. So why do you believe that multilateralism is the best way of tackling climate change?
Well, climate change affects us all, but affects us disproportionately and does not stop at national borders. Countries in the global south are far more affected by the climate crisis than we are, even though we, as the largest CO2 emitting nations, are primarily responsible for the crisis. This is also understood by the more than 6 million young activists who are taking to the streets weekly to demand more climate justice, who my co-delegate Paul Clara and I have gotten to meet during our mandate as youth delegates. We thus urgently need the UNCCC protocols like the Kyoto and the Paris Agreement, the COPs, the Climate Action Summit, and a relatively new body launched by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, the Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change with 7 young leaders who advised the UNSG in climate questions, and he acted on the need to include young people in this. Simply, we need effective multilateralism to tackle the climate crisis, and we can only achieve that together through multilateral agreements. If we don't act now together, we will face even more consequences by this failure.
But Thorsten, I don't wish to rain on anyone's parade, but there is always a dichotomy with a multilateral agreement, because it can uphold that concept in one sense, but not necessarily in another. For example, you might have a group of countries which agree on setting an environmental standard, but not necessarily on how to enforce it. So if it's imposed via an import restriction, does that make the trade measure multilateral or unilateral? And how do you resolve those dichotomies?
I'm not sure. I mean, there were many important voices from the citizens that you interviewed. I'm not sure whether that's the biggest conundrum that we're facing. I think many were very right to put Corona first and the pandemic that we're dealing with. And I think in a year's time, if most in most countries say that we took a solidarity approach where we made sure that no country was left behind, that no citizen in no country was left behind, where we fairly shared access to medicine and vaccines, I think then we will have achieved quite something. Right now, that's not a foregone conclusion. I think the European Union was very right in, and also Germany, and now the US is on board in supporting the COVAX facility for equitable global sharing of vaccines. But right now, the very discussions that we have in Europe about vaccination not proceeding fast enough, having access to vaccines and so on, it shows that we have a long way to go toward true solidarity and really ramping up production of vaccines to serve everybody globally. And I think that should be a priority right now, because this is a true global public good. If every citizen were vaccinated globally, and I think Germany is very right to put a premium on supporting efforts that lead to this kind of global equitable sharing of access to vaccines.
Okay, let me bring in Helga, and let's take it back to this point about these unresolvable conundrums, because the argument is that it doesn't, well, it shows that multilateralism perhaps lacks real clarity. And if that's the case, doesn't that potentially undermine an organisation's ability to meaningfully tackle issues that the public feels very strongly about, be it vaccinations, climate change, or racism?
Yes, but you need to rally for support, and multilateralism and a multilateral approach is actually helping to get as much support as possible. Just look at COVAX, equitable global access to vaccines and medicine is a great idea, but it can only be achieved by setting up a structure where many countries are contributing money, first of all, but also ideas. And I just don't know how else this could have been achieved than by setting up this Act A alliance.
Right, but there may well be, I mean, that's an example where countries can work together successfully, but there is also the argument that sometimes working together in a multilateralist framework can slow things down by making it difficult, for example, to actually reach an agreement, or perhaps empowering one party above another. And doesn't that reality perhaps not bode quite so well for tackling some of the major issues that people are worried about going forward?
I'm sure there are examples like that. When you trying to achieve small solutions for local problems, but as we found out within the European Union, you very often, because I mean Germany is a country with so many borders, it's great to have a solution for yourself, but it really doesn't help, because there is another very open border, and if you have that problem on the other side of that border, you're still in trouble. So and on the other side, I mean, there is this line, I think, coined by a Belgian politician, who said there are small countries and countries that haven't found out that they are small. So each country's influence is rather limited, and we in Germany are quite aware of our own. Maybe we perhaps are a fairly large country and economy within the European Union, but on a global scale, we're quite small. We really are.
Okay, this is a question which I'd actually like to put to Thorsten and Eva. Eva, if you can respond to it first. Are there times when countries are probably better off working alone than together. For example, the European Union fought over how much financial aid it should give to those countries which were hardest hit by the pandemic. Similarly, we've had some countries which have better distribution and COVID vaccination rates than others. Now, those are not really a good advert for multilateralism, so sometimes isn't it better to go solo than work in partnership?
Yes, it may seem easier to just go solo, but the outcome will not be better. So actually, to be honest, I cannot think of any situation, any global problem, any challenge where multilateralism would not be the answer. If you all have a common goal in mind, like the well-being for all, for example, a unilateral approach will never be more successful than to strive for the best together.
Okay, and can I get your response, Thorsten, to that point about countries, sometimes it might be better for them to actually go it alone rather than work with others if it's seen as somehow a hindrance, slowing things down?
I think if you're a reasonably small or middle-sized country, you'll find it hard to meet a global problem that you can just tackle by yourself. So I think there's a necessity to work together. It's a truly global challenge, but it doesn't always need to be with everybody. These can be flexible configurations of like-minded players. On human rights, to really truly advance human rights, you cannot have Saudi Arabia and China in the boat. You really need to you need to do it in alliances of the like-minded. So I think there's different configurations of multilateralism. I think on some issues a big country may decide it can just go it alone, but that's usually not an option for a medium-sized or a small country.
Okay, let's stay with public opinion because I want to bring in a couple of results from a recent survey on multilateralism and international cooperation, and it was conducted for Körber Stiftung, the results of which were the catalyst for the Alliance for Multilateralism that we've been referencing throughout this discussion. Now, their survey brought up some interesting results, a couple of which are as follows. Now, those questioned were asked the following. In your view, is multilateralism a positive or negative thing? Now, of the 1,000 people questioned, the results came out as follows. 78% were positive, 11% negative, and the remaining 11% were either neutral or unsure. The next question we picked out was this. Should Germany cooperate with other nations to solve global challenges, even if this initially implies putting national interests in second place? And these were the results. 28% yes, definitely. 47% yes, generally. 15% no, generally. 7% no, definitely not. Okay, so those were the results. Helga and Thorsten, I'd like to get your responses to them. Helga first, because obviously some very positive results for multilateralism, but again, playing the cynic, is that because Germany disproportionately benefits from a cooperative and rules-based international order? So yes, it's bound to give the thumbs up, isn't it?
There is certainly no harm in benefiting from cooperation, but I don't think that we actually benefit more from this than others. And as a middle power, we need to be able to rely on rules and norms, and we have to protect the international norms, agreements, and institutions. What I'm a bit worried about is the nationalist angle that has come out with the discussion on vaccines in the last couple of weeks and months, and I would be quite curious about this about the survey, if it was conducted with a focus on vaccines and conducted this afternoon instead of probably a couple of months ago.
Okay, and Thorsten, can I get your response as well to that point which emerged, which I made earlier, in fact, to that question to Helga, that perhaps the results for multilateralism were very positive because Germany disproportionately benefits from a cooperative and rules-based international order?
Maybe they were also positive because it was not a concrete trade-off that citizens responding to that question were asked to make. And Helga is very right. It's a tough call, for example, on vaccines. And I think very few citizens And if I, for example, had to choose whether my parents should get the vaccines first in Germany or some other people of the same age in a Latin American country, and we should ship the vaccine there first, I think it's fairly understandable that many in Germany would want to make sure that our citizens get vaccinated early on, while also making sure that other countries can afford access to the vaccine. But I think once you're confronted with a very concrete trade-off, of course, you want to make sure that your own citizens are not put at a disadvantage. And the whole kind of vaccine discussion, therefore, is pretty tricky, because there are very few cosmopolitans out there who would say that we need a really truly equitable distribution of vaccines, meaning that it should really be a global order of priority. First, all old people across the world vaccinated, and then just slowly coming, because it's just the pressure in our countries right now. We're under lockdown. We have the countries that haven't controlled the virus yet in Europe. There's enormous pressure to get access to vaccines fast, to restart our normal lives again. And there, of course, the appetite for immediate solidarity is not that high.
Okay, but Eva, let me bring you into the conversation, because what's emerged from that survey is that the majority of Germans are actually very positive about multilateralism. But isn't there also a sense, notably among young people, that they can't participate in these negotiations because they're complicated and sometimes ineffective? So I guess there is that danger of generational estrangement.
Yeah, thanks, Juliet. But isn't exactly that the case with most conferences and negotiations? I mean, I could list all the ones that young people can attend, and we would agree that there are not many opportunities for young people to effectively have their say in policy making. For example, there are only around 35 countries with youth delegate programs to the United Nations General Assembly, but over 190 member states. At the same time, young people see these multilateral negotiations as often ineffective, because the added value of international cooperation is measured by young people in terms of the outcomes, what we just stated before. So for young people, successful multilateralism is not content with unsatisfactory outcomes. So as long as no serious progress is heard on climate change, as long as young people have no voice in peace negotiations, as long as human rights violations are not ended by multilateral agreements or are tolerated through them, multilateralism has failed for young people.
Okay, then let's move on to another point in this survey, which we didn't illustrate with the graphics. It was an extensive survey, but something which leapt out at us certainly when we were going through the data. And it's a point which I want to address to Helga and Thorsten. So again, Helga, if you could tackle it first, because what emerged was that you've got the French and German public generally agreeing on many issues, being very supportive about multilateralism, but the support seems to wane off when we're talking about the European Union. So as I understand it, for example, the Germans are more significantly supportive of the bloc than the French. And of course, the irony is that France and Germany are the main engines behind the EU and, of course, the Alliance for Multilateralism. I mean, how do you square that? Because that is a pretty explicit contradiction.
I would ask the political scientist to start with his explanation, and I chime in later. Thank you.
Okay, then. Well, let's get the response then of the political scientists. I mean, how do you explain that contradiction that on the one hand, you've got the two key players in the alliance and in the EU who support the ideas, etc., but then you've got one party which is more Eurosceptic than the other?
I think the contradiction you can easily explain. The Alliance for Multilateralism is supported by the German government and the French government. Both are very much in favor of multilateralism. But at present in France, you have a stronger sovereigntist opposition movement than you have in Germany. In Germany, mostly the sovereigntists are relegated to the Alternative for Germany right-wing party. You don't have them very much in the political center, and even Die Linke, the left party, is not that sovereigntist. But in France, you have sovereigntism and nationalism on both ends of the political spectrum. On the very left with Mélenchon and others, and on the very right with Le Pen, squeezing the center with the Eurosceptic sentiments. So that is just much stronger right now in the French public. Macron, that's his whole political project. That's why I mentioned his reterming, or rephrasing or reframing of sovereignty as European sovereignty, not in opposition to national sovereignty, but enhancing national sovereignty. He's trying to go against this both left-wing and right-wing nationalism in France, but that the strength of that Euroscepticism and the nationalism that you see in French political debates, you see expressed in that opinion poll that you cited.
Absolutely. Okay, so a great explanation there. But Eva, let me bring you into the conversation again, because look, multilateralism, it's generally going to succeed. I think we can all agree on that, at least if people do feel empowered and if positive change is enabled, which begs the question, is multilateralism doomed if it doesn't deliver on those possibilities, not just for your generation, but for the generations that are here, the older people? Everybody needs to feel that they can be involved in this. They want something out of it.
Yes, so multilateralism is not doomed, but negotiations and existing institutions become less effective and sustainable without considering the possibilities that are there, especially in the long term. So policies are less approved in society, and trust in international institutions beyond government and cooperation is weakened considerably. But we are already seeing what results from this now, and Thorsten described them earlier very well. Nationalism and populism are on the rise, which also results in shrinking spaces for civil society, as well as the major pushback for human rights activists and people with their unique views and experience are systematically excluded. So the result will be then a different kind of multilateralism, not the ones that we are trying to achieve now, like a value-based, all-encompassing approach that respects human rights, but a new one that deals with only individual problems, that is organized informally, that disappears after a successful or even failed problem process. So on the other hand, what do we have to lose by allowing young people to participate? When negotiations become more difficult and complicated, don't young people tend to think more straightforwardly and more directly and more honestly away from power interest? Well, and also no one ever said that multilateralism should and is easy. So yeah, of course, we need to see the possibilities and also act and align on them.
Right, but Helga and Thorsten, the opening part of Eva's statement there, that nationalism is not doomed. So is it now in the last chance saloon, bearing in mind that the extremists, they've had their day in the sunshine, but they haven't gone away. They're still hanging around outside the door.
Absolutely, and that's why it's really important to engage the public for policymakers and explain what, for example, being a member of the European Union means for us, and this and all the advantages it has for us, instead of flying solo. I think that's perhaps also. I'm coming back to your last question. There is, I think, there is more awareness in Germany perhaps than in France. What we owe to the European Union, how much of our prosperity and our freedom we owe to the European Union, perhaps more than in France. But you're right. You see a lot of very vocal nationalism, not just in Germany but in many other EU member states. And I would like to underscore that multilateralism is it's not an end in itself. That was actually something that President Trump has said very often, how our governments practice multilateralism as an end in itself. Of course, it's a method of working. It's a way of listening to partners and incorporating their their ideas into your own thinking. And I would always argue for a multilateral approach, also to the general public at large, including civil society, is also a multilateral approach. And I'm not sure whether I would limit participation only to young people, but what I can see is that the federal government is actually running many more processes with civil society participation, with NGOs. We are consulting with, and this can be extremely time consuming, and it's not always easy, but it's we actually get new ideas that we haven't come up with ourselves, and of course you create a much broader basis for the things you try to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you. And can I get a response to that point, Thorsten? Is multilateralism in the last chance saloon?
I think it's for multilateralism, multilateral arrangements to demonstrate and for political leaders to make sure that multilateralism actually delivers for the average citizen. If citizens have the impression that multilateralism, multilateral arrangements, for example, on trade, disproportionately favor elites or certain sectors, they will go against them. That's why I think President Biden and also his new national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, are very right in terms of putting a premium on making sure that multilateral arrangements do deliver for the American middle class. And that will, of course, put them maybe on a collision course sometimes with Europe on trade issues, but Europeans also need to make sure the same, that it kind of delivers for the middle class in a globally equitable kind of way. And that's, I think, the best way to convince a skeptical public.
Okay, Thorsten, thanks for that, because I now want to move on to put the focus on the Alliance for Multilateralism. I know it's an organisation that you, Helga, are very keen to promote. But before I ask you a few questions about it, let's take a look at the key objectives of the Alliance.
International law and human rights. Human rights must be respected and promoted. Humanitarian organisations must be allowed to do their work. The Alliance works to defend humanitarian principles and to strengthen human rights. Global public goods. The COVID-19 pandemic has been a wake-up call for multilateralism. To master this challenge and others, we need strong and agile international organizations whose members fulfill their commitments and pay their dues. Cyberspace. Cyberspace connects people across borders. The Paris Call for Trust and Security and other initiatives are aimed at strengthening rules for behavior online together with civil society organizations. Climate and security. The Alliance promotes joint action on climate change and demands a more systematic approach to its security implications. Rules for weapons systems. The weapons systems of the future need new international rules, and the rules need to be kept for the old ones. Nuclear arms control must be safeguarded. The use of future weapons systems must be firmly grounded in international law and state control, joint rules and stronger dialogue. Our world needs cooperation, solidarity and team players, such as those who come together in the Alliance for Multilateralism.
Okay, so we've got a pretty comprehensive picture there about what the Alliance for Multilateralism represents, what it does. So Helga, can you tell me how many countries actually belong to the Alliance so far, have joined, and are China and Russia amongst them? Would you welcome their involvement?
That's an excellent question. We're about 60 countries, and for the last meeting in the margins of Anger, we had 70 participants at ministerial level, but there's no membership. You don't carry a card because you're a member of the alliance, because cooperation is issue based. And as I said in the beginning, not all of those who join the alliance have to support all of its initiatives and be keen on all the issues. But we have actually adopted some principles as well, and they include, for example, to protect, preserve, and advance international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law. And we've put that in writing, and we haven't heard that China or Russia are keen on signing that. This is actually a very interesting time, because we're testing the waters, how to continue with the Alliance for Multilateralism with the US as a back on the not back on the international scene, but back with a much more multilateral approach of its own. And Thorsten has quite clearly, and I was happy to hear that, advocated for keeping the alliance, and that's certainly something we want to do.
Okay, and please do go on. Please do go on.
No, I'm fine. I was finished. Thank you.
Okay, then. I mean, Eva, you've been listening into this as well. I mean, how do you feel about the alliance, and more specifically, its non-binding nature? Do you feel that it can do enough to ensure that all member states are committed to their goals, that they don't fall off the rails?
So with the majority's support and convictions consolidated in the alliance, contributions can be made to the emergence of new international treaty law. So moreover, it is a space where states can express their legal convictions, which civil society can very well invoke. So just because it is non-binding does not mean there is no accountability at all. But of course, it would be more desirable if there were clearly defined follow-up mechanisms so that states feel incentivized to do even more in the right direction according to the alliance resolutions. And finally, it should be noted that the initiatives lack accountability mechanisms and thus sanction possibilities. Some projects, such as the Humanitarian Call for Action, intend to have those follow-up mechanisms, but they are so non-binding that they neither create legal obligations nor can they be understood as an additional incentive for government action. After all, according to what Paul and I learned during our visit to the German Foreign Office, the agreements are the signatures of foreign ministers, which per se are ascribed as value.
Okay, let's move on now, because we want to hear what our viewers think. In fact, we did put some questions out to them to get involved with this, and we got quite a few responses. Here's one, for example, and I would like to get the panel's reaction to this. The UN is ineffective and paralysed. Do we even need it anymore? The ultimate multilateralist body. So, Helga, what's your response to that question? In fact, there's one here as well. Multilateralism sounds very vague and abstract. Why should I be interested? But I'm specifically interested in that question. The UN is ineffective and paralysed. Do we even need it anymore? Helga, what's your response to that?
Of course, we need it as we needed it during the last decades. But of course, the UN has to be reformed. That's also part of our approach.
Thorsten, what's your response to that question?
I mean, of course, the UN just reflects the state of its members. So you cannot blame the UN for being paralyzed, but you can blame the disagreements of individual member states. And then you have to kind of draw your conclusions from that. I think, as I said before, on some issues you need to kind of pursue alliances and coalitions of the like-minded to advance things when there's a gridlock, and when you cannot agree with certain other countries, you can at least push ahead with coalitions of like-minded. But we do continue to need we continue to need the UN as a universal membership for to actually argue out differences and to make disagreements visible and to try to forge common ground that was the idea of the United Nations. It was born after the disaster of 2 world wars, and those were the lessons. And one of the first UN Secretary Generals said that the purpose of the UN is not to bring us all to heaven, but to save us from hell. And that's, I think, a modest but very appropriate motto for the United Nations. And as we're moving to ever more heated geopolitical confrontations, I think we will find that even though it's gridlocked, even though it's ineffective at times, we do need universal membership bodies such as the United Nations.
Okay, can I just have a very, very brief response to that question as well from Eva about the United Nations being ineffective and paralysed? Do we even need it anymore? Very briefly, Eva.
Yes, I can agree with Helga and Thorsten what they said before. And also the UN is the only organization with this normative framework that they have, and they're dealing with every topic that they could possibly deal with. So yes, we do need it, even though it should be reformed.
Okay, then thank you so much for that. Let's move on now, because we have been running a poll on Twitter asking people which of these issues should multilateralism prioritise: COVID-19 or global health, climate change, cybersecurity or peace and security. We have the results of that coming up. They are as follows. 12% of you said that it should be global health, 32% climate change, 12% cybersecurity, and 44%, pretty overwhelming, peace and security. Okay, very, very briefly, panel, I would like to get your response to that data, starting first with you, Helga, and then Thorsten, and then Eva. Can I have your response to those poll numbers, please, very briefly?
I think you would have very different numbers this year. I'm not sure how when the survey was conducted, but I'm pretty sure that people would now feel and tell that global health is the #1 subject.
Okay, Thorsten.
It's not a meaningless poll, but I think these are all for such important issues that we don't have the luxury and privilege to say one is more important than the other. Just because we have a pandemic now doesn't mean that climate is no longer important, or that peace and security is no longer important, or even cybersecurity. So I wouldn't waste too much time on a survey like that.
Okay, then fairly decisive response. And finally, Eva.
This survey, although I myself participated in that survey, and the numbers in general are not surprising, as this is exactly what we as youth delegates learn while consulting young people for their aspirations, visions and dreams for a better, sustainable and more just world.
Okay, then finally, I'd like to end with a question that broadens the panel's horizons and indeed looks to the future. Again, a question to each of you in one sentence. Why is this topic, multilateralism, so important to you personally? In one quick sentence, Thorsten first, then Eva, and then Helga.
Because it's politically divisive, explosive and interesting, and on a personal level, I think it concerns our shared future, and that's why it's motivating to work on it.
Okay, and Eva?
So for me, multilateralism is the only path to a fair, just and sustainable future for all of us.
And finally, Helga?
Because it lets us pool power and join forces for a common good.
Can't put it any sweeter than that, but that's it from us. A big thank you to my guests, Helga Barth, Thorsten Benner and Eva Croon. We'll see you again very soon on the next Diplomacy in Dialogue. Goodbye and stay safe.